Hey everybody, and welcome to our Wednesday devotional. We're in the Restoration series. We're talking about the book of Amos. Each week, Pastor Rachel and I will be talking about different characters and places and things like that from the book of Amos. And I thought it would be good for this week we talk about the character of other nations. Now, that may seem a little silly to have other nations as a character, but all throughout the Bible, other nations besides Israel and Judah play a huge role in the Bible and play a huge role in the relationship between God and the Israelites and God and other nations. And so I thought it would be good to just kind of take a look at God and the relationship between the two. Why does it seem like God is always angry with the other nations? I think this is something that is asked a lot, and people don't quite understand a lot of the times. Is God just like, these are the morals that I have, and if you don't live up to, if you're not the Israelites, then you're not a part of me? And that's not quite what's going on here. You see, God had a way that God wanted the world to work, a shalom, if you will, right relationship between God and humans, and right relationship between humans, and right relationship between creation and humanity and God. And so many times the other nations chose to go against that right relationship. They would fight between one another. They would bring violence and war and hatred between one another. They would try to make their name great in the nations. Power and dominance ruled the day. And so God could not have that in his right world. And so the nations needed to be called back to a better understanding. In the Old Testament, God used the nation of Israel to do that. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery, out of bondage, gave them a right relationship, a covenant with God, and called them into relationship. He said, God called on Mount Sinai, God said, you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You are called to be the message of salvation and grace and love of God to the rest of the nations. The problem is that the nations chose not to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so God had to do something else. God had to make a way. And the prophets came out of that. Prophets calling the other nations and calling Israel back to themselves. So here's a couple things you need to know about God and other nations. One, God doesn't just care about the Israelites. I think this is a misnomer in the Old Testament, that the only time that God cares about the other nations is if they're aligned with Israel. And that's not true. God cares about everyone. And the first two chapters of Amos is proof of that. Even when they are fighting against other nations besides Israel and Judah, God still cares about the morality. God still cares about what they're doing. It's not just when they're in relationship with Israel. And then God cares about everyone all over the world. God wants shalom, salvation, right relationship for all. So the question then ends up is, this is two violent chapters that we're reading this week. So what does this have to do? What is God trying to say about the other nations? And I think this will be a surprise to many to see, but it is absolutely true that God doesn't want violent, dominant malice in the world. God is not a wrathful, vengeful, violent God in the Old Testament. Sometimes God has to give the nations over to themselves, give Israel over to themselves, give the Philistines over to themselves, and violence happens because of that. But God actually wants peace and wholeness and right relationship for all of these groups. And God's push forward doesn't just happen when Jesus shows up. It's not like violent, poof, Jesus, yay, now we're peaceful. No, that's not the case. God is a God that is moving the Israelites and moving all the nations towards peace. That's what he wants for them. He wants the lion to lay down with the lamb. This is his hope. He wants swords to be beat into plowshares. This is his hope. And if that's the hope that the prophets are calling the people to, like, listen, you've been violent too long. God is going to bring punishment upon you. You've been violent too long. You've been hurt too long. If that's what's happening then, what does the prophets have to say 3,000 years later? We've already heard the message of Jesus to love our neighbors, to love our enemies, to always push for peace and love and grace for others. We've heard that, and here we are 3,000 years later, living in a world of violence and power and dominance between the nations and also between ourselves. So what do the prophets have to say about our situation? I believe that the prophets are speaking to us about violence in this world, in this nation, in our state, and in our cities. Are we just like, we're not violent, so, war's going to happen. Violence in our streets is going to happen. Gun violence is going to happen. Or are we truly being prophetic people and saying violence is wrong? And we're not just going to be, hey, violence is bad. We are going to be anti-violent and pro-peace. What does it mean in our world today to be anti-violence and pro-peace? I think that's the question that the prophets would like us to ask. And it's the question that I think we should be asking each other today. Thanks.